Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something a little unusual. We're going to travel back. Not to one place, not to one culture, not to one moment in time, but to a question that seems to echo across every corner of the human story. And that question is this: why does almost every civilization on Earth remember a great flood? Not a rainstorm, not a river that got a little out of hand one spring. A flood. A vast, world-altering deluge that swallowed the land, erased what came before, and left only a handful of survivors to carry the memory forward. You might be settling in right now, pulling a blanket a little closer, letting the day begin to soften at its edges. And that's exactly where we want you. Because tonight's story isn't urgent. It isn't alarming. It is, in many ways, one of the oldest and most quietly remarkable mysteries that humanity has ever sat with. And we're going to sit with it together. The flood myth appears in Mesopotamian clay tablets older than most of recorded history. It appears in the sacred texts of ancient India, in the oral traditions of indigenous Australians, in the legends of the Maya, the Hopi, the Norse, the Greeks, and dozens of cultures across sub-Saharan Africa and the Pacific Islands. Researchers have cataloged somewhere between 200 and 300 distinct flood narratives from cultures spanning every inhabited continent. Let that number settle for a moment. 200 to 300 stories from people who never met, never traded ideas across an ocean, never sat around the same fire. And yet they all remembered water. Tremendous, overwhelming water. Now, your first instinct might be a practical one. Of course, people remember floods. Floods happen. They are among the most common natural disasters on Earth. Every river floods. Every coastline knows a storm surge. Maybe the universality of the myth is just a reflection of the universality of the experience. And that is a completely reasonable thought. Historians have made exactly that argument. But here is where it gets interesting, and just a little harder to explain away so tidily. It isn't simply that people remembered floods. It's that they remembered floods with strikingly similar details. A chosen individual or family warned in advance. A vessel of some kind. Animals brought aboard. A great darkness or covering of the sky. The waters receding slowly. A bird sent out to test the land. A new world emerging, quieter and emptier than the one before. These aren't just water came and it was bad. These are structured narratives with recurring motifs that appear across cultures separated by thousands of miles of ocean and thousands of years of independent development. That, scholars will tell you, is harder to explain. Historians still argue whether the parallels between global flood myths reflect a shared ancestral memory, independent responses to similar geological events, or something more complex woven into the fabric of human storytelling itself. And the honest answer, for now, is that no one is entirely sure. Here is an eccentric detail that might make you smile before you drift. One of the most persistent recurring elements across flood myth from completely unconnected cultures is the motif of a warning delivered by a non-human messenger, a dream, a god, a fish, an insect, before the rain begins. It's almost as if every culture independently decided that a flood of this scale simply had to come with prior notice. The universe, apparently, owes you at least a heads up. There's something almost comforting in that. Tonight, we're going to move slowly through several of these stories. We'll look at what geology and climate science have uncovered about the end of the last ice age, a period of real, dramatic, world-changing flooding that reshaped coastlines across the globe. We'll visit ancient Mesopotamia, Vedic India, ancient China, and the Aboriginal communities of Australia, where oral traditions may preserve memories stretching back 10,000 years or more. We'll ask, with genuine curiosity and no agenda, what the convergence of all these stories might mean. This isn't a conspiracy. It isn't a theological debate. It is simply one of the most fascinating open questions in the intersection of archaeology, climatology, and human memory, and it is the kind of question that opens beautifully in the quiet hours of the night, when the thinking part of your brain has loosened just enough to wonder without needing to conclude. If you find these sleepy tales comforting, you can like and subscribe, but only if it feels right. And if you'd like to leave a comment before you close your eyes, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. There's something lovely about knowing that people in a dozen different time zones are all settling into the same story at once. Someone in Auckland already asleep. Someone in London just turning off the lamp. Someone in Sao Paulo with a warm drink. The city humming softly outside. You're all here together, which is its own quiet miracle. So, before we begin properly, take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let the day go. It will still be there in the morning, but tonight, it doesn't need anything from you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing, for a moment, in the position of an anthropologist in the early 20th century. Not a glamorous position, necessarily. A lot of notebooks, a lot of sea voyages, a lot of sitting in uncomfortable chairs in university libraries, surrounded by stacks of translated texts and field reports from missionaries and explorers who had fanned out across the globe during the preceding centuries, dutifully, if not always respectfully, recording the stories of the peoples they encountered. And as you sit there, flipping through these accounts, something begins to nag at you. Something quiet and persistent, like a word you can't quite remember, but know is on the tip of your tongue. The stories are different. Of course they are. The names change. The gods change. The geography shifts. In one story, the flood hero is a Mesopotamian king. In another, he is a Vedic sage. In another, he is simply the first man, the ancestor of everyone who came after. The vessel that saves him is sometimes a great wooden ark, sometimes a reed boat lashed together at the edge of a rising river, sometimes a mountain he is guided toward just in time, the water lapping at his heels as he climbs. But underneath all of that surface variation, something remains the same. And as you lay the stories side by side, Sumerian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, Aztec, Norse, Chinese, indigenous Australian, a pattern begins to emerge that is genuinely difficult to dismiss as coincidence, no matter how skeptical you'd like to be. Let's walk through it gently, the way you turn the pages of an old book by lamplight. In nearly every major flood narrative across the world, there is a single figure or a small group, chosen to survive while the rest of humanity does not. This isn't simply a story about some people being lucky. The survivor is specifically selected, warned in advance, and given instructions. There is intentionality in the telling. Someone or something decided that this particular person was worth saving and took steps to make sure they knew what was coming. That detail alone, the chosen survivor, the prior warning, the deliberate preservation, appears in flood myths from Mesopotamia, the Hebrew Bible, ancient India, ancient Greece, Mesoamerica, and several Pacific Island traditions separated from the ancient Near East by thousands of miles of open ocean. Then there is the vessel, not always a boat in the Western sense, but some form of enclosure that protects the survivor from the water. A ship, a great raft, a sealed wooden chest, a hollowed mountainside. The specifics shift from culture to culture, but the underlying concept, containment, protection, floating above the destruction while the world below disappears, recurs with a consistency that is hard to set aside. Then the animals. Many flood traditions include the idea that the survivor preserved not just himself and his family, but the creatures of the living world, or at minimum, the animals necessary for life to begin again in the silence after the waters receded. The ark motif, in other words, is not exclusively biblical. Versions of it appear in Mesopotamian texts that predate the Bible by over 1,000 years, in certain South American oral traditions, and in scattered accounts collected from communities across Southeast Asia. Then the bird. This one is quietly astonishing and worth pausing on. In the Babylonian flood story, one of the oldest written versions we have, the survivor sends out a dove, a swallow, and a raven to test whether the waters have receded enough for land to be found. The raven does not return. The dove comes back with a fresh leaf clutched in its beak, and the survivor, knows the world is beginning to reappear. In the biblical account of Noah, the sequence is almost identical, detail for detail. But strikingly similar bird messenger motifs appear in flood traditions from ancient India and from indigenous communities in the Americas. Cultures with no documented contact with the ancient Near East, separated by geography and time in ways that make direct borrowing deeply unlikely. Historians still argue whether this specific motif traveled silently along ancient trade and migration routes, carried in the minds of wandering peoples across continents, or whether it represents something so intuitively logical. Of course, you would send a bird ahead to check for dry land. What else would you do? That it arose independently in multiple places at different points in human history. Both explanations remain possible. Neither has been fully proven. That tension is part of what makes this question so enduring. Here is your eccentric detail for this section, and it is a genuine one. A flood narrative documented from a small indigenous community in the Bolivian highlands includes the specific detail that the survivor was warned not by God, not by a dream, not by a divine messenger of any recognizable kind, but by an ant. The ant, apparently, noticed the water rising before any human did and communicated the danger in a way the survivor understood and trusted. Researchers cataloging global flood myths noted this account with some quiet delight because it suggests that even the identity of the messenger can be startlingly variable across traditions. What remains constant, regardless of who or what delivers the warning, is the structure beneath it. Something perceives the danger before you do. It reaches you in time. You listen. You act. You survive. That structure, warning, preparation, survival, renewal, is so consistent across so many unconnected traditions that it has led some researchers to wonder whether it reflects not just a shared storytelling instinct, but a shared memory of something that actually happened. Something large enough to leave a mark on every culture that lived through it. Something that rewrote the shape of the world. And in the section just ahead, the geology begins to speak. Close your eyes for a moment. Not all the way, just enough to soften the edges of the room around you. Now imagine the Earth as it was 20,000 years ago. Not a dramatic alien landscape. Not a world of fire and chaos. In many ways, it would look familiar. There would be mountains in roughly the same places. Rivers carving paths through valleys. Wind moving across open plains. Stars overhead. The same stars in the same arrangements that ancient navigators would later use to find their way across open water. But the water itself, that would be different. Strikingly, quietly, profoundly different. We are at the peak of the last glacial maximum, the point in Earth's recent history when glacial ice reached its greatest extent across the planet's surface. Ice sheets stretched across what is now Canada and much of the northern United States, reaching in some places 2 miles thick, so heavy that the land beneath them actually compressed downward under the weight, the way a mattress yields slowly under something very heavy placed upon it for a very long time. Across northern Europe, the ice extended from Scandinavia down into what is now Germany and the British Isles. Much of the Alps were buried. Siberia was locked. Patagonia, at the southern tip of South America, carried its own great glaciers grinding slowly toward coastlines that no longer exist in the same form. And because so much of the planet's water was locked inside all of that ice, held there, frozen, removed from the ocean's reach, the sea level was dramatically, almost incomprehensibly lower than it is today. We are talking about approximately 120 meters lower, nearly 400 feet. Let that number find its full weight in your mind. The coastlines of the world 20,000 years ago looked nothing like the coastlines we know. Vast stretches of continental shelf that are now submerged under the ocean were then dry land, grassland, forest, wetland, places where animals grazed and rivers ran, and, eventually, where human beings built their lives. The British Isles were not islands. They were the western edge of a continuous landmass connecting to mainland Europe, a broad plain that geologists now call Doggerland, stretching across what is now the southern North Sea. Hunters walked across it. Communities lived on it. Rivers drained through it into an ocean that was far to the west of where it sits today. In Southeast Asia, the islands we now know as Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines were connected by exposed land into a vast continent that researchers call Sundaland, a landmass roughly the size of India that is now almost entirely submerged, its former rivers and valleys resting quietly under the warm shallows of the Java Sea. In the Americas, the Bering Land Bridge, technically a broad plain, not a narrow crossing, connected Asia to North America across what is now the Bering Strait. People walked across it. Animals migrated across it. Entire populations moved through it, southward, over generations, spreading eventually across two continents. This is the world that existed. It was not mythological. It was not symbolic. The geological record is precise and consistent, built from ice cores and sea floor sediment samples and fossilized pollen and the dated remains of trees and animals found on the continental shelves. Physical evidence of a world that human beings actually inhabited that is now beneath the sea. Historians still argue about the precise population density of these lost coastal regions and whether their submergence contributed meaningfully to the oral traditions that eventually became the flood myths we know. But the land itself is not in dispute. It was there, then slowly it was not. Here is your eccentric curiosity for this section. In the North Sea, commercial fishing trawlers have periodically dredged up from the seafloor the bones of woolly mammoths, ancient aurochs, and even, on at least one documented occasion, a barbed antler harpoon point crafted by human hands, a tool made by a person who stood on dry land in a place that is now 30 meters underwater. That harpoon point has been dated to roughly 11,000 years ago. Someone made it, used it, lost it, or left it behind, and the sea eventually came and covered everything, leaving only that small carved piece of bone as evidence that a person was once there, living a life in a world we can no longer visit. That image, quiet and specific as it is, does something to the imagination. It makes the abstraction real. The last glacial maximum began to ease around 19,000 years ago. The ice didn't melt all at once. Nothing so large moves quickly, but the warming began, and with it the slow return of all that frozen water to the world's oceans. What followed was not a single event. It was a process, a long, uneven, punctuated process that would unfold over thousands of years, reshaping the planet's coastlines incrementally, and occasionally, as we'll explore in the section just ahead, with sudden violence. Because while most of the melting was gradual, there were moments when it was not. There were pulses, periods when the rate of sea level rise accelerated dramatically, when ice sheets collapsed in ways that sent enormous volumes of cold water into the ocean over spans of decades or centuries rather than millennia. And those moments, some researchers believe, may be exactly what the storytellers were trying to remember. The world was not simply getting wetter, slowly and quietly, in a way you might adjust to without quite noticing. Sometimes the water came fast. Sometimes the water came faster than a person could run. Let that thought rest softly at the edge of your mind as you settle a little deeper into the quiet of wherever you are tonight. The ice is beginning to melt. The long drowning is about to begin. There's a particular kind of change that is almost impossible to perceive while you are living inside it. Not the sudden change, the storm, the earthquake, the fire that takes a village in a single night. Those are changes you feel in your body, changes that announce themselves with noise and heat and the unmistakable knowledge that something is different now than it was an hour ago. No, the change we are talking about is the other kind, the slow kind, the kind that happens at the edge of your vision, just outside the range of a single human lifetime, advancing so quietly that no individual person ever quite sees it happening. Only the accumulation of many lives, many generations, many inherited memories of a shoreline that used to be further out, a valley that used to be dry, A village that your grandfather's grandfather spoke of that is now, somehow, beneath the water. This is the world between roughly 19,000 and 6,000 years ago. A planet in the long process of warming, its ice sheets retreating northward and upward, releasing their water back into the oceans in a process that was mostly gradual, but not always. Scientists studying the period have identified several episodes of dramatically accelerated sea level rise, moments when the pace of change lurched forward in ways that would have been perceptible even within a single human lifetime. The most significant of these is known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, which occurred approximately 14,600 years ago. During this event, sea levels rose by somewhere between 16 and 25 meters, that is, between 50 and 80 feet, in a span of roughly 500 years. Possibly less. 500 years sounds like a long time. In human terms, it is perhaps 20 generations. But for a coastal community with no written records, no maps, no instruments for measuring the sea's slow advance, 20 generations is both a long time and a terrifyingly short one. Long enough to forget that the change is happening. Short enough that the stories of what the shore used to look like, what was lost, what the water took, could still be alive in the mouths of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The shore was out there once, the elders would say. We used to walk to where the sea now sits. And they would have been telling the truth. Historians still argue about the precise mechanisms behind Meltwater Pulse 1A, whether it originated primarily from the collapse of Antarctic ice sheets, North American ice sheets, or some combination of both. But the reality of the sea level rise itself is well established in the geological record, preserved in coral formations and sediment cores from coastlines around the world. Here is something to sit with. During the peak of the melting period, some researchers estimate that global sea levels were rising at an average rate of roughly 1 meter per century across certain intervals. That may not sound alarming. 1 meter per century, spread across a long flat coastline, might mean the tide reaching a few miles further inland over the course of several generations. But on shallow, gently sloping continental shelves, exactly the kind of terrain where early human communities tended to settle, near rivers, near the coast, near the rich resources of shoreline environments, that rate of rise could translate into the loss of enormous areas of habitable land within living memory. Imagine returning to the place where your parents were married and finding it underwater. Imagine your children returning to the place where you built your home and finding the same. Now imagine that happening not once, but across multiple generations, in different places, as the sea kept coming and the old landmarks kept disappearing beneath the surface. That is not mythology. That is not metaphor. That is what happened. And here is your eccentric detail, quiet and specific. Geologists mapping the submerged continental shelf off the coast of northwestern Australia have found evidence of ancient freshwater river systems, channels carved by rivers that once flowed across dry land, now sitting under more than 100 meters of seawater. These rivers fed into valleys, and those valleys supported vegetation, and that vegetation supported animals, and those animals supported people. Communities existed in places that are now, and have been for thousands of years, part of the ocean floor. The land did not flood dramatically in a single event. It simply never came back. There is a second category of change worth mentioning here, alongside the gradual rise, the episodic catastrophe. Because while most of the melting unfolded slowly, certain specific regions experienced sudden, dramatic inundations, moments when a natural barrier failed, or a glacial lake released its contents, or a low-lying plain was connected to the rising sea for the first time, and water moved across the landscape, not over centuries, but over days. These events, precise and violent and local, would have been seared into the memory of anyone who survived them in a way that gradual change simply cannot replicate. You do not tell stories about the tide coming in a little further each decade. You tell stories about the day the water came and did not stop. Those are the stories, some researchers believe, that became the flood myths. Not one global event, not a single divine punishment, but many real local catastrophes spread across thousands of years and dozens of cultures, each one experienced as the end of a known world. Because for the people living through it, it was exactly that, a sleepy thought to carry with you now, as you let your breathing slow. Every coastline you have ever stood on is younger than you might think. The sea has been rearranging things for a very long time. And in one specific corner of the ancient world, it may have done something so dramatic, so sudden, and so complete that the memory of it has never fully left us. That is where we're going next. There's a body of water sitting at the intersection of Europe and Asia that has been quietly holding one of the most debated geological secrets of the last 30 years. You may know it as the Black Sea. Today, it is a large, semi-enclosed inland sea, connected to the Mediterranean through the narrow Bosphorus Strait and the smaller Sea of Marmara. A chain of waterways so narrow that in the city of Istanbul, which straddles the Bosphorus, you can stand on one shore and see the other side clearly on a calm day. Ships pass through it continuously, tankers and ferries moving between the two great bodies of water that the strait connects. But there is a theory, first proposed formally in 1997 by two Columbia University geologists named William Ryan and Walter Pittman, that the Black Sea was not always what it is today. And the story of what it might have been and what might have happened to it is one of the most quietly dramatic proposals in modern geology. Ryan and Pittman's hypothesis begins during the peak of the last ice age, when so much of the world's water was locked in glacial ice and sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. In that colder world, the Black Sea basin was not connected to the Mediterranean at all. Instead, it was an isolated freshwater lake, significantly smaller than the sea we know now, fed by rivers draining from the surrounding mountains, sitting well below the level of the world's oceans. People lived along its shores. Archaeological evidence, including submerged settlements and ancient shorelines mapped by underwater surveys, suggests that the basin's edges were inhabited. Communities built near the water, fishing its freshwater depths, farming the fertile land around it. Then the ice began to melt. Across the Mediterranean, ocean levels rose. The Aegean Sea filled. The Sea of Marmara deepened. And at a certain point, Ryan and Pittman propose around 5,600 BCE, though the dating has been disputed. The rising Mediterranean waters reached the rocky sill of the Bosphorus and began to pour over the edge. What happened next, if the hypothesis is correct, would have been extraordinary. The water from the Mediterranean, salt water and heavy, cascading down into the lower freshwater basin of the Proto-Black Sea, would have created a waterfall of almost incomprehensible scale. Ryan and Pittman estimated the flow at something like 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls, pouring continuously, day after day, week after week, as the Mediterranean drained into the basin and the Black Sea's level rose. Rapidly, relentlessly, unstoppably. The shoreline would have advanced inland at a rate of perhaps a mile or more per day in the flatter regions surrounding the basin. A mile per day, not per year, not per decade, per day. For the communities living along those shores, there would have been no gradual adjustment, no slow recognition that the water was creeping closer season by season. There would have been the ordinary morning, and then there would have been the water coming fast and not stopping, and the desperate movement inland, uphill, away, carrying whatever could be carried, leaving behind everything that could not. Historians still argue vigorously about whether the Black Sea flood hypothesis is correct, and the debate has sharpened considerably since Ryan and Pittman first published it. Subsequent underwater surveys of the Black Sea floor have found evidence of ancient shorelines and river channels, consistent with the idea of a formerly lower lake. But other researchers have challenged the timeline, the scale, and the mechanism, arguing that the transition may have been more gradual than the dramatic cascade Ryan and Pittman described, or that the Bosphorus connection may have opened earlier or in stages rather than in a single catastrophic event. The honest position as of the current state of the evidence, is that the Black Sea was almost certainly once a lower, fresher body of water that became connected to the Mediterranean as sea levels rose. But whether that connection was catastrophic or gradual remains genuinely unresolved. Here is your eccentric detail, and it is a memorable one. When underwater archaeologists and geologists first began mapping the ancient Black Sea shoreline using submersible cameras in the early 2000s, they discovered something unexpected in the sediment layers of the deep basin. Because the Black Sea's deep water is almost entirely anoxic, meaning it contains virtually no oxygen. Organic material that sinks to the bottom is preserved rather than decomposed. Wooden structures, organic debris, potentially, if they exist down there, the remnants of ancient human habitation preserved in the cold, airless dark of the deep basin for thousands of years. The deep Black Sea, in other words, may be one of the most extraordinary underwater archaeological archives on Earth, a cold, dark library of a vanished world, largely unread. What connects this to our broader story is the geography of what happened afterward. The communities displaced by the Black Sea's transformation, if Ryan and Pittman's hypothesis is broadly correct, would have scattered outward in every direction. North into the Eurasian steppe, west into the Balkans and eventually Europe, south and east into Anatolia and the ancient Near East, into Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia, as it happens, is where some of the oldest written flood narratives in human history were eventually set down in clay. Stories of a great inundation, a chosen survivor, a vessel, a world remade by water. Whether those stories trace a direct line back to the Black Sea basin, or emerge from different floods entirely, or arose from the accumulated memory of many water catastrophes layered over centuries of retelling, is a question no one has yet answered with certainty. But the geography is suggestive. And the next stop on tonight's journey takes us directly into that ancient land between the rivers, where a story older than the Bible was pressed into wet clay by hands that understood, perhaps better than most, what it meant to live between water and sky. Let your mind travel now to a place of flat land and wide skies. A land defined not by mountains or forests, but by two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, running roughly parallel to each other through a broad alluvial plain, draining eventually into the Persian Gulf. A land so flat that the horizon seems almost impossibly distant, and where the relationship between human civilization and water has always been intimate, complicated, and occasionally terrifying. This is ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the place where writing was invented, where the first cities grew, where the first legal codes were carved into stone, where human beings first began, in a formal and systematic way, to write down the stories they had been telling each other for generations beyond counting. And among the first stories they wrote down was one about a flood. The text we know today as the Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest works of literature in human history. Its earliest surviving fragments date to around 2100 BCE, though the stories it contains are almost certainly older than that, drawn from oral traditions and earlier written versions that have not survived intact. The epic follows Gilgamesh, the king of the ancient city of Uruk, a figure who may have had some historical basis, on a journey that becomes, at its deepest level, a meditation on mortality, friendship, and the limits of human power. Toward the end of the epic, Gilgamesh encounters a man named Utnapishtim, and Utnapishtim tells him a story. It is the story of a flood. Utnapishtim was a man of the ancient city of Shuruppak on the banks of the Euphrates. The gods, he explains, decided in council to send a great flood to destroy humanity, though their reasons are somewhat murky in the text, reflecting perhaps an older, less fully rationalized version of the myth. One god, Ea, chose to warn Utnapishtim in advance. Not directly, because Ea had sworn an oath not to reveal the god's plans to mortals, but cleverly, by speaking the warning to the walls of Utnapishtim's reed house, knowing that Utnapishtim was listening on the other side. Tear down your house, The voice said, "Build a boat. Bring aboard the seed of all living things." Utnapishtim obeyed. He built a great vessel. The text describes it in considerable technical detail, with multiple decks and precise dimensions. Caulked it with pitch and bitumen, loaded it with his family, his craftsmen, animals of every kind, and whatever goods he could carry. Then the storm came. The description of the flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh is among the most vivid passages in ancient literature. The storm gods unleashed their fury. The sky turned black. The noise was so overwhelming that even the gods were frightened by what they had set in motion, and they retreated to the highest heaven and crouched there like dogs, pressing against the walls in fear. For 6 days and 7 nights the storm raged, and the flood covered the earth. Then, on the 7th day, the waters began to calm. Utnapishtim opened a window. He looked out across the silence. Everything was flat. Everything was water. The world had been returned to its original, undifferentiated state. Water in every direction, to every horizon, under a sky that was only beginning to remember how to be still. Eventually, the boat came to rest on a mountain. Utnapishtim sent out a dove, which returned having found no resting place. He sent out a swallow, which also returned. Finally, he sent out a raven, which did not come back, a sign that somewhere the water had receded enough for the bird to land and feed. The parallels with the later biblical account of Noah are so extensive that when the Gilgamesh tablets were first translated into English in 1872 by a British museum scholar named George Smith, the discovery caused a sensation. Smith reportedly became so excited upon reading the flood passage that he began removing his clothing in the middle of the reading room, which is perhaps the most entertainingly eccentric response to a literary discovery in the history of scholarship. Historians still argue about the precise relationship between the Mesopotamian and biblical flood traditions, whether the Hebrew version was directly borrowed from Babylonian sources during the period of the Babylonian exile, or whether both drew independently from a much older shared tradition reaching back to the earliest layers of Near Eastern storytelling. The question of priority and influence has never been fully resolved, and probably never will be. Here is what is not in dispute. The Mesopotamian flood story predates the biblical one by at least 1,000 years in its written form. Utnapishtim was telling his story to Gilgamesh on clay tablets centuries before the final editors of Genesis set their version down on parchment. Here is your eccentric detail for this section. Archaeologists excavating the ancient city of Ur in the 1920s, led by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley, discovered a thick layer of water-deposited silt buried deep beneath the city's foundations, a stratum of clean, flood-laid sediment approximately 3 meters deep, with human occupation layers clearly present both below and above it. Woolley initially believed he had found physical evidence of the biblical flood itself, a claim that generated enormous excitement and significant subsequent skepticism. Later analysis suggested the deposit was more likely evidence of a major local flood of the Euphrates, significant and destructive, certainly, but regional rather than global. But the deposit was real. The flood had happened. Something had come and covered the city so completely that it left 3 meters of clean silt where a city had been. And someone, after the waters retreated, had climbed back up through the mud and begun again. As you settle deeper into this quiet hour, carry that image with you for a moment. Not the catastrophe itself, but the return. The moment when the water was gone, the sky was clear, and someone looked at the mud-covered remnants of everything they had known and decided, without fanfare, to start building again. That impulse to rebuild, to continue, to press forward into whatever world the flood has left behind, may be the oldest and most persistent human story of all. And it appears, as we'll see in the sections ahead, in forms both familiar and wonderfully strange, in cultures spread across the full breadth of the inhabited world. There is a story that begins with a fish small enough to hold in the palm of your hand. That detail alone should tell you something about the tradition we are entering tonight. a tradition that has always understood that the most important warnings do not always arrive in impressive forms, that the divine does not always announce itself with thunder and magnitude, but sometimes appears quietly in a small and ordinary thing, asking only to be noticed and taken seriously. We are moving now from the flat river plains of Mesopotamia eastward, across the great subcontinent of India, into one of the oldest continuous literary and spiritual traditions in human history. The Vedic tradition, which gave rise eventually to Hinduism as we know it today, contains within its vast body of sacred texts a flood narrative that shares certain structural features with the Mesopotamian stories we explored in the last section, and yet feels, in its texture and its meaning, entirely its own. The story is known as the legend of Manu and the fish, and it appears in several ancient Indian texts, including the Shatapatha Brahmana, one of the prose texts of the Vedic canon, and later in the great epic, the Mahabharata. The versions differ in certain details across these sources, as oral traditions naturally do when they travel through centuries of retelling, but the core of the story remains consistent and recognizable. Manu, whose name shares a linguistic root with the English word man and the Latin manus, reflecting ancient Proto-Indo-European connections that philologists find endlessly fascinating, is the first man, the progenitor of humanity, a figure whose role in Indian tradition is roughly analogous to Adam in the Abrahamic traditions, though the texture of his story is quite different. One morning, Manu is performing his ritual washing at the riverbank, a mundane, ordinary act, the kind of thing a person does without particular expectation, when he scoops up a small fish in his cupped hands. The fish speaks. It asks Manu to care for it, and in return it promises to save him from a great flood that is coming. A flood, the fish tells him, that will sweep away all creatures from the earth. Manu, to his considerable credit in the narrative, does not question this too extensively. He places the fish in a jar. He tends to it carefully. As the fish grows, he moves it to progressively larger containers. First a larger jar, then a tank, then a river, and finally, when the fish has grown to an enormous size, he releases it into the ocean. Before it disappears into the deep water, the fish gives Manu his final instruction: build a ship. Attach a rope to it, and when the flood comes, fasten that rope to the fish's horn and let it tow you to safety. The flood comes, as promised. The waters rise and cover everything. And the great fish, now revealed to be either the god Brahma or, in later versions of the story, the god Vishnu in his first avatar, the Matsya or fish incarnation, pulls Manu's vessel through the water, guiding him northward to a high mountain where the boat eventually comes to rest as the waters recede. From Manu, the story tells us, all of humanity descended. He is the survivor. He is the beginning of the world that came after. What makes this story particularly interesting in the context of our broader exploration tonight is not simply its structural similarity to other flood narratives, the warning, the vessel, the survival, the renewal, but the specific quality of its opening image, the fish in the palm of the hand. In the Mesopotamian tradition, the warning comes through the walls of a reed house, whispered by a god who cannot speak directly. In the biblical tradition, God speaks to Noah plainly and with authority. But in the Manu story, the warning arrives in the most vulnerable and unassuming form imaginable, a small creature, cupped in human hands, dependent on human kindness for its survival. The relationship is reciprocal from the very beginning. Manu protects the fish. The fish saves Manu. Care, given becomes care returned, across the vast scale of a world-ending flood. That is not simply a narrative detail. It is a philosophical statement about the relationship between humanity and the natural world. A statement woven into the structure of the story so completely that it cannot be removed without the story ceasing to be itself. Historians still argue about whether the Manu flood narrative developed independently within the Indian tradition or whether it shares a common ancestral source with the Mesopotamian stories, perhaps carried eastward along ancient trade and migration routes through through what is now Iran and Afghanistan during the 2nd or 3rd millennium BCE. The linguistic connections between Vedic Sanskrit and ancient Mesopotamian cultures are complex and contested, and the question of direct influence versus parallel development remains genuinely open. Here is your eccentric detail for this section. In some later Sanskrit retellings of the Manu story, scholars have noted the inclusion of specific botanical details about the plants and seeds that Manu was instructed to preserve aboard his vessel, a level of agricultural specificity that has led certain researchers to suggest the narrative may encode ancient knowledge about seed preservation and crop diversity that was considered important enough to weave permanently into the fabric of a sacred story, ensuring it would never be forgotten. In other words, the flood myth may have been used, among other things, as a mnemonic device, a story shaped specifically to preserve practical survival knowledge across generations in a form that people would remember and repeat. A story about saving seeds, told as a story about saving the world. There is something in that idea that feels both very ancient and very contemporary in the best possible way. Let your breathing slow now, just a little more. We have moved from Mesopotamia to India, and the story has shifted in texture and tone while remaining, at its heart, recognizable. A warning received, a preparation made, a world submerged, and then, slowly, returned. Somewhere to the east of where Manu's fish first spoke from cupped human hands, another civilization was grappling with water on an almost unimaginable scale, and their solution was unlike anything we have encountered so far. They did not build a boat. They built a different world. The flood traditions we have visited so far share a particular shape. Water comes. A survivor is warned. A vessel carries that survivor above the destruction. The waters recede. A new world begins from a single, preserved thread of the old one. It is a narrative of endurance, of waiting out the catastrophe in a protected space, passive in the face of overwhelming force, trusting that the water will eventually relent and that something worth returning to will remain. But the Chinese tradition remembers its great flood differently, not as something to be survived by floating above it, not as something to be endured in the darkness of a sealed hull while the world outside dissolved. The Chinese flood is something to be solved, to be worked, to be, through enormous collective effort and generations of dedicated human labor, defeated. That difference in approach, patient endurance versus active engineering, is not a small cultural footnote. It reflects something deep about how these traditions understood the relationship between humanity and the natural world, between human will and cosmic force, between the individual and the collective. And it gives the Chinese flood tradition a texture and a tone unlike anything else we have encountered tonight. The story centers on a figure named Yu, and it begins not with Yu himself, but with his father, a man named Gun. In the time of the legendary Emperor Yao, the Great Flood had already been raging for generations. This is important. The Chinese flood is not a sudden catastrophe that arrives, peaks, and recedes within a human lifetime. It is a chronic condition, a permanent state of crisis that has persisted for so long that entire generations have been born into a flooded world and have never known anything else. The waters cover the land. The people are displaced and suffering. Agriculture is impossible. The normal structures of civilization have broken down under the weight of endless inundation. Emperor Yao tasks Gun with solving the problem. Gun's approach is to contain the water, to build dikes and barriers, earthen walls meant to hold the flood back from habitable land, to carve out protected spaces within the inundation and allow life to continue inside them. He works at this for 9 years. It does not work. The dikes fail. The barriers are overwhelmed. The flood continues. Gun is eventually executed for his failure, and the task of solving the Great Flood passes to his son, to Yu. And Yu takes a fundamentally different approach. Rather than trying to contain the water, to push back against it and hold it in place, Yu decides to work with it, to understand where it wants to go and to help it get there. He studies the landscape, He maps the rivers and the mountains and the valleys. He identifies the natural channels through which the water could drain if those channels were cleared, deepened, widened, connected to one another in the right sequence. And then he begins the work. What follows in the legend is one of the most extraordinary descriptions of civil engineering in ancient literature. Yu leads teams of workers across the landscape, digging channels and clearing obstructions and redirecting rivers for 13 years. He works so continuously, so completely devoted to the task, that the legend records specific details meant to illustrate the totality of his commitment. He passes by his own home 3 times during those 13 years, close enough to hear his children crying inside, and does not stop, does not go in, does not allow himself the comfort of his own family until the work is done. His body bears the marks of the labor. Some versions of the legend describe you developing a particular lopsided gait from years of physical work in difficult terrain, so characteristic that the dragging, effortful walk came to be known in ancient Chinese as the step of Yu. After 13 years, the flood is tamed. The waters drain through the new channels Yu has carved. The land reemerges. Agriculture becomes possible again. Civilization, patient and persistent, resumes. Yu becomes a great ruler, eventually founding the Xia dynasty, the first dynasty in traditional Chinese historical accounts, though its historicity has been debated by archaeologists for decades. Whether or not the Xia dynasty existed in the form the tradition describes, Yu himself has been venerated in Chinese culture for thousands of years as a model of public virtue, selfless dedication, and practical wisdom. Historians still argue about whether the legend of Yu preserves a memory of actual large-scale hydraulic engineering projects undertaken by early Chinese civilizations in the Yellow River Basin, a region historically prone to catastrophic flooding, or whether it is primarily a mythological narrative constructed to explain the origins of Chinese civilization and legitimate early dynastic authority. Recent archaeological discoveries in the Yellow River Valley, including evidence of a massive flood event around 1900 BCE associated with a natural dam collapse, have renewed scholarly interest in the historical kernel that may lie within the Yu tradition. Here is your eccentric detail for this section. In certain regional versions of the Yu legend preserved in southern China, Yu is assisted in his flood control work not only by human laborers, but by a yellow dragon and a black tortoise, who help him survey the landscape and mark the terrain. The dragon drags its tail along the ground to indicate where channels should be dug. The tortoise carries a chart of the land on its back. Researchers studying these variants have noted that the animal's roles are surprisingly practical. They're not performing miracles, but providing information, functioning essentially as divine surveying instruments in a story that is otherwise deeply concerned with the practical logistics of large-scale engineering. Even the mythological assistants in the Chinese tradition are put to work. A sleepy refrain, offered gently as you settle into this quiet hour. Across Mesopotamia, across India, across China, 3 traditions, 3 floods, 3 responses shaped by 3 different understandings of what human beings are and what they owe to the world they inhabit. The Mesopotamian survivor waits in a sealed boat. The Vedic survivor trusts the fish that trusted him first. The Chinese survivor puts down his tools only when the work is done. All 3 worlds end in water. All 3 worlds come back. And there is one more flood tradition waiting for us, older in its continuous telling than any of these, carried in human voices across a span of time, so vast it strains the imagination to hold. We are going next to the oldest living civilization on Earth. There's a particular quality of attention that develops in a people who have lived in the same place for a very long time. Not the attention of a newcomer, alert and excited, cataloging everything because everything is unfamiliar. Not the attention of the traveler, gathering impressions to carry home, but a deeper, quieter, more intimate kind of attention. The attention of people whose relationship with a landscape extends not just across their own lifetime or their parents' lifetime or their grandparents' lifetime, but across hundreds of generations of continuous habitation, continuous observation, continuous conversation between a people and the land they call home. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have lived on that continent for at least 65,000 years, possibly longer. That number is so large that it resists easy comprehension. To put it in the most direct terms possible, when the ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians first arrived on the continent, the species of human being we call Neanderthal had not yet disappeared from Europe. The pyramids of Giza would not be built for another 60,000 years. This is the oldest continuous civilization on Earth and one of its most remarkable features. Increasingly recognized by scientists over the last 2 decades is the possibility that its oral traditions have preserved accurate memories of events that occurred not centuries ago, but thousands of years ago. Specifically, memories of a coastline that no longer exists. As we discussed in our earlier sections, the end of the last ice age brought dramatically rising sea levels to coastlines around the world. Australia was no exception. During the last glacial maximum, the Australian coastline extended significantly further than it does today, in some regions by as much as several hundred kilometers. Vast areas of continental shelf that are now shallow ocean floor were then dry land, inhabited and familiar, part of the living geography of Aboriginal communities. As the ice melted and sea levels rose, those coastlines retreated. Over thousands of years, the sea advanced across the continental shelf, swallowing the land incrementally, pushing communities inland, erasing the beaches and river mouths and coastal features that had been part of daily life for generations. And here is what has begun to capture the serious attention of researchers in recent years. Certain Aboriginal oral traditions appear to contain geographically accurate descriptions of coastal features that were submerged between 7,000 and 12,000 years ago. In 2020, a study published in the journal American Geologist, led by researcher Patrick Nunn of the University of the Sunshine Coast and his colleague Nicholas Reed, examined a collection of Aboriginal stories from coastal communities around the Australian continent. These stories described specific geographical changes, places where the sea had advanced over land, where islands had once been connected to the mainland, where freshwater sources had been swallowed by saltwater. When the researchers cross-referenced these story locations with geological data about post-glacial sea level rise, they found a striking degree of correspondence. The stories were describing real places, real changes that had occurred, according to the geological record, between approximately 7,000 and 12,000 years before the present. That would make these oral traditions among the oldest accurate geographical records in human history. Memories of a world that changed, preserved in story form, passed from voice to voice across 300 or more generations without losing their essential geographical truth. Historians and anthropologists still argue about how to interpret these findings, and the debate is a genuinely important one. Skeptics note that oral traditions are not static. They change with each retelling, absorbing new details and shedding old ones, and that the correspondence between story and geology, while suggestive, may reflect later observation of visible coastal changes rather than continuous memory stretching back to the original events. Supporters of the hypothesis argue that the specificity and geographical accuracy of the stories, combined with the conservative transmission practices of Aboriginal oral culture, make genuine deep-time memory the most plausible explanation. The honest answer is that both positions have merit, and the question is not yet resolved. Here is your eccentric detail for this section, and it is one of the most quietly extraordinary facts in this entire story. Among the Aboriginal traditions examined by Nunn and Reed was a story from the Narangga people of the Eora Peninsula in South Australia, which describes a time when Spencer Gulf, now a large body of seawater extending roughly 300 kilometers inland from the Southern Ocean, was dry land that could be walked across. Geological data confirms that Spencer Gulf was indeed substantially shallower and partially dry during the period of lower sea levels following the last glacial maximum. and that it filled progressively as seas rose. The story, in other words, appears to describe a real geographical condition that existed thousands of years ago and has not existed since. Someone saw it. Someone remembered it. Someone told someone, who told someone, who told someone, across hundreds of generations of human lives, until it reached the researchers who finally understood what they were hearing. There's something in that chain of transmission that is almost impossible to hold in the mind without feeling something. Every link in that chain is a human being, a person with a name, a family, a daily life, a fire they sat around in the evening. Each one received the story from someone older and passed it on to someone younger, faithfully enough that the geographical truth survived intact across a span of time longer than the entire history of writing. Let your mind rest in that image for a moment. The campfire, the story, the careful voice of someone who understood, even if they did not fully know why, that this particular memory mattered, that it needed to be kept, that the world it described, though gone beneath the water, deserved to be remembered. And this brings us, gently and naturally, to a question that has been waiting at the edge of tonight's journey since we began. How long can a story truly last? What are the real limits of human memory, carried not in books or clay tablets or stone inscriptions, but in the oldest medium of all, the human voice, passing something precious from one generation to the next, in the dark, by firelight, for thousands of years? That is the question we turn to now. You have, at some point in your life, played the telephone game. Perhaps as a child, in a classroom, or at a party. A whispered message passed from person to person around a circle, each one hearing it once and repeating it as faithfully as they could to the next, until the final version was read aloud and compared to the original. The result, almost invariably, was laughter. The message had mutated. Details had slipped. Words had been replaced by similar-sounding words that meant something different. The original sentence, recognizable at the start, had become something new and strange by the time it completed its circuit. That experience, intuitive, universal, amusing in a controlled setting, is probably the main reason most people, when they first encounter the idea of oral traditions preserving accurate memories across thousands of years, feel a quiet instinctive skepticism. Surely, you think, it cannot really work that way. Surely something gets lost. And you are right that something always gets lost. The question, and it is a genuinely fascinating one, sitting at the intersection of cognitive science, anthropology, linguistics, and archaeology, is how much, and under what conditions, and whether the losses are random or whether certain kinds of information survive with surprising reliability even across enormous spans of time. Because the telephone game, as it turns out, is a deeply misleading model for how oral tradition actually functions in cultures that take it seriously. The telephone game passes a message once, in a single direction, through a chain of individuals who have no particular investment in accuracy and no tools to support it beyond a single unreliable hearing. It is specifically designed to produce error. Oral tradition, in cultures that have developed it as a primary technology of knowledge preservation, works almost nothing like this. In many traditional cultures, sacred or historically important narratives are not passed casually or once. They are taught formally over extended periods by designated knowledge keepers whose social role is specifically defined by their responsibility to transmit the tradition accurately. The student does not hear the story once and repeat it. The student hears it many times from multiple sources and is corrected when their version deviates from the established form. The transmission is redundant, cross-checked, and embedded in social structures that create real consequences for inaccuracy. Aboriginal Australian oral tradition, to return to our previous section's focus, is among the most formally structured in the world. Certain stories are restricted, accessible only to initiated members of specific groups, transmitted only under specific ceremonial conditions, their content protected by layers of cultural protocol that limit casual drift and unauthorized modification. The story is not just a story. It is a possession, a responsibility, a sacred object in linguistic form, and it is treated with the kind of careful handling that valuable and irreplaceable things deserve. This doesn't make oral transmission perfect. It remains vulnerable to catastrophic disruption, epidemic, warfare, the destruction of a community, the death of a knowledge keeper before full transmission has been completed. The colonial history of Australia, like the colonial history of most of the world, includes the deliberate and incidental destruction of oral traditions that had survived for millennia, broken in a generation by the removal of children from communities, the suppression of language, the deaths of elders whose knowledge died with them. What was lost in those disruptions is genuinely incalculable. But what survived, in communities that maintain continuity, is remarkable enough to have attracted serious scientific attention. Historians and cognitive scientists still argue about the theoretical upper limit of accurate oral transmission, whether there is a ceiling beyond which no tradition, however carefully maintained, can remain reliably accurate. Some researchers, drawing on the Aboriginal coastal memory studies we discussed in the last section, have proposed that under the right cultural conditions, accurate transmission across 10,000 years or more is not only possible but demonstrable. Others maintain that this claim is extraordinary and requires a higher standard of proof than has yet been met, pointing to the inherent difficulty of verifying accuracy for events that left limited physical records. Here is your eccentric detail, and it is a genuinely arresting one. Researchers studying the oral traditions of the Klamath people of Oregon and the Modoc people of Northern California documented stories describing a great catastrophic event, a mountain that fell and a battle of fire in the sky, that correspond with striking geographical and geological specificity to the volcanic eruption and collapse of Mount Mazama approximately 7,700 years ago, the event that created what is now known as Crater Lake. Geologists confirmed the eruption date through physical evidence. The oral traditions, preserved across nearly 8,000 years of continuous transmission, appear to contain an accurate eyewitness account of one of the largest volcanic events in North American prehistory. 7,700 years. In human generations, assuming an average of about 25 years per generation, that is approximately 308 generations of people, each one receiving a story from someone older and passing it forward to someone younger. 308 links in a chain, and the geographical truth still present at the end of it. The implications for our flood narratives are significant. If oral tradition can preserve accurate memories of a volcanic catastrophe across nearly 8,000 years, then the Aboriginal coastal memories we discussed and the flood traditions from cultures around the world become more rather than less plausible as genuine records of real events. The human capacity for faithful transmission under the right cultural conditions is apparently greater than the telephone game would suggest. What this means for the flood myths specifically is not that they're all literal history, perfectly preserved. The process of transmission shapes, as well as preserves, details migrate, meaning shift, the supernatural elements that make a story memorable and worth repeating accumulate over generations. A real flood, remembered and retold, becomes larger, more total, more divine in its scale and meaning with each passing generation, because those are the qualities that make a story survive. The most important events dress themselves in the most powerful language available. And floods, as we are about to discover, have always had a particular power over the human imagination that goes beyond their physical scale. There's something about what water does to landscape, to memory, to the human sense of continuity and home that marks more deeply than almost any other force in nature. That is where we're going next. Think for a moment about the different ways a landscape can be changed. Fire moves through a forest and leaves behind a blackened hillside. Stark, dramatic, unmistakable. But within a season, the first green shoots are already pushing up through the ash. Within a decade, the forest is returning. Within a century, if you did not know where to look, you might walk through that regrown forest and find almost no trace that anything had burned at all. The land heals along its original contours. The hills are still where the hills were. The rivers still run in their old channels. The fundamental geography of the place persists beneath the temporary devastation. An earthquake reshapes the land more dramatically. Fault lines shift. Ground rises or subsides. Coastlines drop into the sea in catastrophic cases. But even here, the change is largely local, and the human community, if it survives, still occupies a recognizable version of a landscape it knew before. The mountain is still roughly where the mountain was. The valley is still a valley, even if parts of it have changed. But a flood, a true, sustained, large-scale flood, does something that fire and earthquake do not. It erases not just the structures built upon the land, not just the crops and the livestock and the accumulated material wealth of a community, but the land itself in the most psychologically significant sense. The landmarks are gone. The paths are gone. The places where important things happened, where ancestors were buried, where the boundaries between one community's territory and another's were marked and understood, all of it is gone, or changed beyond recognition, or sitting beneath water that shows no sign of carrying what used to be below it. This is the quality of flood destruction that distinguishes it from almost every other kind of catastrophe, and it goes a long way toward explaining why floods leave marks on human memory that other disasters, equally devastating in terms of immediate death and suffering, do not leave in the same way. An earthquake kills people and destroys buildings, but survivors can return to the site. They can stand where their home stood and understand the geography of their loss. The place is still there, even in ruin. They can bury their dead in the ground that knew them. They can rebuild on the same foundations, oriented to the same hills, drawing water from the same river. A flood takes the place itself, and when the place is gone, when the very ground of identity and memory has been submerged or transformed, the human response is not just grief, but a particular kind of disorientation that has no easy resolution. You cannot return to pay your respects to a landscape that is now 30 feet underwater. You cannot show your children where your parents' house stood when it is beneath a lake. You cannot maintain the ritual practices tied to specific sacred sites when those sites have ceased to exist in accessible form. The continuity of cultural identity, which depends so heavily on place, on the ability to return to significant locations, to maintain an ongoing relationship with a specific landscape across generations, is severed in a way that no other disaster quite replicates. Historians still argue about the degree to which this place-severing quality of floods, as distinct from other disasters, accounts for their disproportionate presence in the mythological and religious traditions of cultures around the world. Some researchers emphasize the psychological dimension, the flood as a symbol of total loss, of the erasure of the known world, that speaks to deep structures of human fear and meaning-making. Others emphasize the straightforwardly historical. Floods genuinely did erase vast, inhabited landscapes during and after the last ice age, and the mythological weight they carry reflects the actual scale of what was lost. The two explanations are not mutually exclusive. They may be, in fact, inseparable. Here is your eccentric detail for this section, and it arrives from an unexpected direction. Studies of communities affected by modern flooding disasters, from the Mississippi River floods of 1993 to the devastating inundations in Bangladesh that occur with terrible regularity, have found that the psychological recovery of flood survivors consistently takes longer and follows a more complicated trajectory than the recovery of survivors of other natural disasters of comparable physical scale. Researchers have attributed this in part to exactly the place-severing mechanism we have been discussing. Flood survivors do not just lose property. They lose the spatial context of their memories. The place where the memory lives is gone, and the memory, untethered from its location, becomes harder to access, harder to share, harder to grieve in the structured way that human beings need in order to move forward. There's a term used in environmental psychology for the grief associated with the loss of a meaningful place, solastalgia. It was coined originally to describe the distress caused by environmental degradation of a home landscape, mining, deforestation, industrial change. But researchers have increasingly applied it to the experience of flood survivors, for whom the term fits with a precision that is almost uncomfortable. The pain is not just about what was lost. It is about the loss of the place where loss could be felt and processed and eventually healed. Water takes the wound and the sight of healing simultaneously. And perhaps this is why the flood stories that survived did so with such tenacity, such structural consistency, such emotional weight across so many generations of retelling. They were not just stories about an event. They were the replacement landscape. In the absence of the physical place, the shore, the valley, the village, the sacred site now beneath the water, the story became the location of memory. The narrative held what the geography could no longer hold. People returned to it the way they might have returned to a place, finding in its familiar contours a way to touch something that was otherwise unreachable. The story was the land that the water had taken. Let that rest in you for a moment as your breathing slows and the room settles around you. There is one more thing to consider before we bring tonight's journey to its close. One final question that has been waiting quietly beneath everything we have explored. Not what happened, not how the story survived, but what it means that they did. What it tells us about human beings, about what we are and what we carry and why it matters. That across every culture and every ocean and every millennium of separation, we kept telling each other about the water. We are almost there. You have traveled a long way tonight. Not in miles. You are still wherever you were when you press play, in your bed or your chair, under your blanket or beside your open window. But you have moved through time in a way that few journeys allow. You have stood at the edge of a world covered in ice. You have watched coastlines disappear beneath rising water, slowly and then suddenly, in ways that no single human life could fully witness, but that many human lives, stitched together by story, could remember. You have sat with flood survivors from Mesopotamia and India and China and Australia, each one carrying forward a memory of water that was too large and too transforming to be allowed to die. And now we arrive at the question that has been waiting beneath all of it. Not a dramatic question, not a question with a clean, satisfying answer that closes everything neatly and sends you to sleep with the comfortable feeling of a mystery resolved. This question is gentler than that. It is the kind of question you hold rather than answer. The kind that does its best work not when you press it toward a conclusion, but when you let it rest in the open, breathing, the way a question should. The question is this: what does it mean that we kept the stories? Not why we kept them. We have explored that tonight, the geological reality, the psychological necessity, the cultural structures that made faithful transmission possible across spans of time that strain the imagination. We have a reasonable understanding of the mechanisms. But what does it mean? What does it say about the nature of human beings that across every ocean of separation, every difference of language and belief and daily life, the same essential story kept surfacing? Water came, and someone survived, and the world began again. One answer, and perhaps the most straightforward one, is that it means the events were real. That real floods, on a real planet in a real period of dramatic climatic transformation, left real marks on the people who experienced them. And those marks were deep enough and vivid enough to persist through thousands of years of retelling without being lost entirely. The story survived because the experience that generated it was genuinely and profoundly world-altering, and human memory, given the right cultural conditions, is more durable than we generally credit it with being. That answer is satisfying in its simplicity and its respect for both science and tradition. But there is another answer, not contradicting the first, but sitting alongside it, that feels worth holding as you drift toward sleep tonight. The flood story, in every culture that tells it, is ultimately a story about continuation, not about destruction, though the destruction is real and vividly rendered in every version. Not about loss, though the loss is total and irreversible in every telling. The flood story is, at its deepest structural level, a story about the fact that something survived, that the water came and took almost everything, and yet here we are. Here is the world. Here are the people in it, descended from the one who held on, who listened to the warning, who built the vessel, who sent out the bird and watched it not return, and understood that somewhere the land was coming back. Every flood myth is, in its bones, a story told by survivors to survivors. And that is not a small thing. In a world that regularly presents human beings with experiences of loss so complete that continuation feels impossible, the death of someone irreplaceable, the collapse of something carefully built, the flooding of a landscape that held everything familiar and dear, the persistence of this story across every culture and every millennium carries a quiet message that is almost embarrassingly simple. It kept going. The world, improbably and repeatedly, kept going. Historians still argue whether the convergence of global flood myths reflects shared geological memory, universal psychological archetypes, ancient cultural diffusion, or some layered combination of all three. That debate will continue in universities and research journals and archaeological field sites for decades to come, and it should. The question deserves the attention. But the argument itself, vigorous, ongoing, genuinely unresolved, is also a kind of testimony to the story's endurance. We're still talking about them. We're still sitting with them in the quiet hours, still turning them over, still finding in them something that repays examination. Here is your eccentric detail for this final section, offered softly as a parting gift. In 2009, researchers conducting a broad cross-cultural analysis of flood myths found that among the details most consistently preserved across unrelated traditions, more consistently even than the vessel, more consistently than the bird, more consistently than the chosen survivor, was the description of the sky clearing after the flood. The return of light. The moment when the darkness and the water both recede and the world is visible again, wet and quiet and new. Every tradition, it seems, remembered the morning after, not just the catastrophe, the return of the light. There is something in that collective insistence on the clearing sky that feels significant, though it resists precise articulation. Perhaps it is simply that the people who told these stories understood, in the way that survivors always understand, that the most important moment is not the flood itself, but the one that comes after, the moment when you open the window or emerge from the vessel or climb down from the high ground, and the world is still there. Changed, yes, emptied and rearranged and unfamiliar in ways that will take generations to fully absorb. But there, still there. Let that thought carry you now, as the last of tonight's journey settles into quiet. You are warm where you are. The concerns of your day are distant now, softened by the hour and by the long travel through deep time that you have done tonight. You have sat with Utnapishtim and Manu and you and the unnamed ancestors of coastal Australia, all of them carrying their memories of water through the long dark of human history, all of them insisting in their different languages and their different landscapes on the same essential truth. The water came, and then the water went, and then there was a morning. Let your breath follow that rhythm now, slow and even, in and out, the way water moves when it is no longer a flood but simply the sea, rocking gently at the edge of shore that is found, at last, where it wants to be. You have been here tonight across thousands of years and dozens of cultures, and in every one of them, someone survived to tell the story. You are the continuation of that survival. You are the morning after every flood that your ancestors ever lived through, and there were many, and they endured all of them. And here you are, warm and breathing, and held by the ordinary miracle of a night that asks nothing from you except that you rest. The stories are safe. The world is still here. And so are you. Sweet dreams.